before I continue, I would like to thank Dr. Swift alluded to the finance department and so forth. So with the departure of Amanda Matheson, we all had to work together to put all these budgets and all the documentation that is necessary that you see before you tonight, but also the packets that should be included in the board packets for the amendment and the in next year's budget. And you see the names: Don McGee, who's our payroll assistant director; Linda Newton, who is our procurement assistant director; and Darcy Francoeur, who is assistant director, primarily accounting and over grants. So, and then Jill and I have also been intimately involved in this whole process to get all the documentation together. So I wanted to publicly thank all of them for their work and diligence to get all of this done. So first, I would like to show what the governor proposed back in February before COVID, before we were hit with the pandemic. So Arbor Public Schools was slated to receive approximately $6.5 million, almost $6.6 million in what the governor proposed. We don't always get what the governor proposed, but there were good intentions there to fund education. So the increase in the foundation was $150, which we have not seen that probably since the early 2000s. So we already talked about the May revenue consensus estimating conference, and we know the amount of funds that the school aid fund is estimated to be short, but there's going to be another, which is the first time, there will be another consensus revenue estimating conference in August to see, especially for both years, to see where we are for this year, and also to estimate for next year, to see if those estimates are coming true or not. So we are assuming in this budget, and Dr. Swift alluded that we don't know how much money we're going to get next year or how much money we're going to be cut next year. So we're making a variety of assumptions. The instructional model today, maybe it's towards that the school will return to full face-to-face. And this is the assumptions that we're making, that school will be back to normal for our school district. So we're assuming there will not be an enrollment increase, that our local taxes, we already know our tax base will, in the general fund, will increase by $5 million, but also there's a corresponding decrease in our state aid because of that increase because the two are kind of related. Also, a foundation, we're projecting a $700 per student reduction to a foundation, primarily because of the what the May revenue consensus conference showed us about the $1.1 billion I guess deficit in the school aid fund. So we are assuming that there will not be change in funding from the WISD, even though the tax base has grown. We also know that the WISD has many cases of severely autistic children, and that they require additional staffing, which will basically, the amount of funds that were going to be available due to the increase to the tax base will actually be spent to provide additional help to special needs children that the ISD serves. So the way the Act 18 funds work is that the ISD gets reimbursed at 100%, and then whatever is left, it is given to the school districts as reimbursement. We have included the collective bargaining agreement settlements, and also we have included about $5.5 million worth of savings from vacant positions. One of the reasons I didn't speak about it even in the 1920 school year, in the current school year where we are now, we have more or less have very selectively allowed any hiring or replacement of any positions. We have been very diligent in reducing staffing through attrition through this year, 1920 school year. So part of the savings that you see in the 1920, part of it is due to COVID. The other part is also due to vacant positions. And we have been, I will show some of the staffing and what's happening there as well. So you'll see that in February, we had approximately 2,132 FTEs. So there are positions that have already left or have already told us that they are retiring. So those would bring, if we included every one of them, it would bring us to 2,039. So there's 93 positions that we know now that they've already left as of February, or they will be retiring as of June 30th. But we did not take the savings from all 93 positions. We have from these 62 positions. So when the instructional model is actually decided upon, then the staffing will have to be figured out as well. But for the purposes of this budget, there's about 62 positions that are not included, and then there's from where we were in February, and there are approximately they're worth approximately $5.5 million. So this is the final amendment, and then you see the budget for next year. And then you'll see, for example, the increase is primarily due to taxes, but also we had to take out the $2.6 million of the cell tower revenue, which is in here. And those are there's other changes, but those are what make the biggest difference. In the state sources, you'll see part of it is because of the tax base growing, and also part of it because we're estimating a $700 per student cut to the foundation. Federal sources, primarily it is going down by $1.8 million. $1.3 million is due to the CARES Act that we received this year. We don't know if we're going to receive anything next year. But also what we don't spend this year, it will be covered, it will be carried over to next year, which we're not planning for it right now. But when the first amendment happens, then all that carryover will be added to next year's revenues and expenditures. As far as the federal sources are concerned, they're all pretty much grants. So there is not a financial impact to the bottom line. It's if there are revenues, there are also corresponding expenditures. And then we already talked about this is primarily the Act 18, and that funding pretty much remains the same. We're assuming next year that will remain the same. So overall, we're expecting a reduction to our revenues by approximately $15.7 million. So on the expenditure side, we still expect our expenditures to decrease by approximately $5.1 million. So approximately, we included the negotiated collective bargaining agreements, the increase in retirement, and then the savings from vacant positions. We've also, because we reduced the revenues on the revenue side on the federal grants, we're also reducing the expenditures, corresponding expenditures. And then we are, all our contracts that are not our employees, they're contracted services, then we put them back in place. So overall, you will see some of the vacant positions, their location, and then in the final amendment, we showed where there was significant savings in operations and maintenance and transportation and so forth. So now we're putting some of the money back because we're assuming we're going to be back to full force, and that's where you see some of the increases that they're putting back. Our expenditures are approximately $256 million, which is approximately $5.1 million less than they were for the amendment. So moving on, what is happening to our fund balance? We expect our fund balance to be reduced by $7.5 million, and it is a pretty obvious picture that is due to the reduction to the foundation. That's why that we're assuming. That's why there's a use of fund balance of $7.5 million. So we're projecting that at the end of next year will be at $13.1 million, which is the equivalent of $730 per student or 13 days of operations. So you can see that we're projecting our revenues to be $248.7, which is almost $16.7 million less than 1920, and then our expenditures to be at 256 versus 261, or $5 million less than we projected for 1920. And then the use of and you can see in 1920 we're expecting to increase fund balance by $3 million, and then to use $7.5 in 2021. So it will bring us down to $13 million, or a 5.27% of revenue, or 5.11 of expenditures, which is right above the 5% where we need to be. And then we're using approximately 2.51% of revenues, or 2.576% for expenditures as far as fund balance is concerned. So, and this just shows the whole revenues and expenditures. I know specifically one of the board members likes to see the whole picture together. So this is where you have the whole picture. It's just the same numbers. It's just the revenues and expenditures are all in one page. Again, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Trustee Lazarus, do you have a question?
Thank you, Vice President Kelly. This is quite a pill to swallow, but this is why we have a fund balance. So I just want to say your assumptions are based on that we will go back to school full-time, where kids are in class like we normally would like them to be. But the reality keeps looking that we may be in a blended situation. So I asked the question, if we're in a blended situation, how does that affect our projections? Is there savings, like how we accrued them over the last couple months, or are there more expenditures?
So
Let me start, Marios, with the lay answer, and then you can give the financial answer. We're still, Trustee Lazarus, running those scenarios with our planning team. So while I know Marios can detail some areas where we might save money, we're not exactly sure of that because, for example, transporting students on buses, if we're required to do it in a socially distant way, we will probably have to run additional bus routes. So we're still running the scenarios to see exactly what our needs will be. But go ahead, Marios, and kind of give the financial. I'm just giving kind of the instructional side of it, but what about the finances?
So I think depending on how the program is structured, so if you have a hybrid and you're still mandated to social distance, if it's the 6 feet, we will only be able to have 12 to 15 students on a bus. Right now we have about 50. It's going to be very interesting as far as transportation is concerned. As far as there's definitely can be savings in other areas. If you're only going to have, for example, in the classroom where you have 25 students, you might not be able to have 20. If you're mandated to social distance, then we're probably looking at about 10, maybe 12 students in a classroom, maybe even less. So there's definitely going to be savings in if you only have 12 students in a classroom, for example, in a variety. I don't want to get into specifics because it might freak people out that are in those positions. But
let's not do that.
But there's definitely there can definitely be savings when you're serving less kids. So in a variety of areas. I think it's going to depend how, I guess, the rules of engagement are and what the district decides. No matter what the state tells us, we might decide something different, something more safe than what the state or the federal government tells us. So it depends how the instructional model is implemented, basically.
And I would just add there that one of the examples the governor gave today, trustees, was perhaps the hiring of additional teachers in order to reduce class size. And of course, we all know, because we work with these budgets, that that's one of the most expensive endeavors in a district, is reducing class size. So we're concerned in a number of areas. The good news about the blended model is that the devices are taken care of through our technology portion of our bond. So we're very grateful, and we know we're very fortunate compared to many districts that we can take care of that part of the expense. But there are other expenses that are unknowns, exactly what you're suggesting, that we'll need to sort out this summer.
I just want to also reassure the community that the number one goal of any of these budgets, because this is a very cursory budget. I mean, we don't have the state funding information. We don't have the federal funding information. They're still bickering at all these different levels. This is where our community really needs to step up and contact the representatives and the senators and on state and federal level to actually let them know that they need to put our kids first, our next generation, because it's not only just schools being successful because of the stability and making sure that the adequate resources are there to prepare them for their life beyond school, you know, elementary and secondary school. But it really depends. It's really depends on the success of our state, because if we're not educating our current generation that's in school, and we underfund them and we take resources away from them is not teaching them how to be knowledgeable and healthy and competent citizens when they graduate. Right. So I think the community really needs to understand that this is a very cursory budget. It's based on the best information that we currently know. And I think having a flat enrollment, because there is conversation in the state that because kids will be all over the place, maybe that's the best way to handle student count. So hopefully maybe that is one of the ways that we can kind of make it through this really tough next year, but there will be amendments. And I just want to make sure that the community knows that the quality of education and the delivery of education to the students is at the top of our list. So there may be financial troubles, but they're nothing that we can't get through. So thank you.
And I'll say this, I think we have taken pretty conservative approach. Mm-hmm. We are basically saying that the state doesn't have any money, it's not going to get any help, and the assumption is that we're going to get cut $700 per student, which has never happened in the past. It's been, it might have happened over a few years, mm-hmm. but never $700 in 1 year. It's a pretty conservative budget. And I think we've also shown that as of last week, that there were also more attrition than what we put in the budget. So there is ways that the school district can, I think the school district, by adding to the fund balance this year, it is putting itself in a very good financial position, and then it's able to weather even the worst of circumstances next year, that is still able to weather the storm and offer the program that it's normally offers, even when our foundation grant might be back to 2000, because a foundation grant today is the same level that it was in 2005, 2006. There's only a few dollars difference. So even cutting $700 from that, it probably goes back to 20 years ago, what we were getting paid 20 years ago. So even with those dire circumstances, the school district is able to manage to be above 5%, which is incredible.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Thank you both for those thoughtful comments. I think that you both really hit the nail on the head on our commitment to serving the kids and also weathering them. So excellent comments there. Thank you. Trustee Nelson.
I have a comment and then a couple of questions. My comment is just to reiterate what has been said before, that I strongly believe this is the right approach to this financial either near crisis or crisis we find ourselves in, that keeping our instructional quality intact this year is very important to our current students. And it is very important to subsequent years when presumably the economy will get better and we will be in a position to take off as opposed to having destroyed some of our capacity. So and perhaps we should also say big thank you to the administration and boards over the last few years, which did build the reserve when there was a better economy. So it's always a little sad to see reserves disappear, but like people said, that's what they're for. My first question is on the positions left vacant. Is there any general pattern to those? And I'm especially concerned about, are there any of those vacancies that are likely to affect our instructional program?
Thank you, Trustee Nelson. I'll take that one. We will be working over this summer to sort through which among those we need to go ahead and fill and what other vacancies might be occurring. So I appreciate you raising that, and I want to go back to Trustee Lazarus's comment that we are going to maintain our program and like you said, keep our instructional approach intact. So, so we will continue to trim in areas where we can trim, but not in areas that are going to impact students. If that does become the case because the federal government maybe doesn't come through or something, then we will be discussing that as we move through the summer. But at this time, it is our goal to continue to trim in areas where we can do so without interrupting program and instructional delivery. And the details of that need to be sorted out over the coming 10 weeks or so.
My second question deals with this 5% threshold the state has in its policies for how it deals with districts. And I realize that with your conservative approach, which I very much agree with, we hope that indeed things turn out better rather than worse than our table. But our tables do show, while we're above 5%, as a percent of expenditures, it's 5.1%, but it's not a lot above 5%. So that's the reason I want to be sure we understand the potential implications. In the Finance Committee, we talked about the rules for when the state becomes more involved in the district. And I was, at least was uncertain whether it was a 1-year trigger, a 2-year trigger, or how does that work? Could you tell us a little bit about how this 5% trigger business at the state level works?
Mr. Dimitri, that's for you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Trustee. So the early warning legislation is when a school district is below 5%, then if we adopt a budget with the fund balance below 5% of revenues, then we must notify the Department of Treasury and also the Michigan Department of Education and the ISD. So that's what happens the first year. Now, if it happens a second year in a row, then we notify them again, and then Treasury will be given a choice. We can work with the Treasury Department, or we can work with the WISD to get out of the 5% and get a fund balance above 5%. So at the second year, we start to lose our independence, and then the decisions that would have to be made would have nothing to do with instruction and everything to do with money. So it is all about getting above the 5% and then staying above the 5%. Now, if the school district, let's just say, goes below 0%, so it goes into deficit, then there is a new trigger that is called, and the school district could end up losing control of the district and There's a process to get an emergency manager, basically, to bring the school district back. Very controversial, very, I've seen it very, up close and personal, and it is not a pretty picture. Let me just say that. So,
Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I think the 5% is very important, that the school district never fails, never goes below the 5% threshold. It is, I think it's very, very important. That's the minimum that it should ever get to.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Trustee Basket.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Trustee Treasurer Lazarus, for noting to the community the reality of budgets. And to you and the other new trustees, I would say, welcome to the board. Some of us have been living this reality of budgets, budgeting, and the process and the hard decisions for years. And thank you, Trustee Nelson, for acknowledging the fact that some of those hard decisions have allowed us to be in the place that we are, which is above water right now. Second of all, I just wanted to say we are not alone, folks. We have other school board colleagues around the state, and I'm happy to say that we are doing better than others, and I'm also sad to say that we are doing better than others. We have, as we know, colleagues across the state have already initiated layoffs, if you will, who have talked about cuts to their employees, and I don't even know if they've announced what they're going to look like in terms of programming. But I also want to set the expectations of our community. I don't want to overpromise when we say we will maintain a quality of educational offerings. The quality, but the delivery may look very different. And that may require some different positions and positions that we may have to add, as well as we may have to leave. I mean, I don't know what 12 kids on a bus looks like. Does that mean we're going to have more buses running? And, again, do we have to check kids at the door to make sure they're wearing their masks and things like that? So, again, let's not overpromise to the community, but be aware that we may have some changes. So I have a couple of questions as I say that. First of all, our policy, thank you, Mr. Demetrius, for acknowledging what we have tried to maintain between at least 6% or more. Do we have to amend our policies regarding that? And then second of all, Dr. Swift, if you could just explain a little bit about employee notification. Should we have to lay off anybody or cut anybody? I know we don't want to talk about that now, but I know I've been asked questions regarding that, and I'm sure other trustees have as well. And again, we're hearing from our other districts in the area who are already looking at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Basket. We will look at that policy. I appreciate you raising that good question. And I recall that the board moved it to a range of fund balance away from just the pure 15% goal. But I appreciate you raising that might need to be amended or suspended as the board wills. And then secondly, we are, trustee, being very aware of the notification timelines that we would need to observe if we were going to get in a position that required layoffs. And we are factoring that in, not only the required notice, but also what we would want to do in terms of making sure that folks have adequate time to transition if we are in such a situation in the coming months or years. Thank you.
And just as a reminder, we're looking at revealing or discussing our options more thoroughly next month in July. And so parents could at least be aware, as well as staffing. Is that still correct? Are we still on that timeline?
We are today hearing the governor say that her group will publish a plan by the end of June. And we have said to the community that our goal is by the end of July. We know, and we all know that COVID is not on our timeline. We are on its timeline. And so I do always want to provide the caveat that we could get to July and have some other intervening facts or situations. But it is our hope to settle on a setting on the dial for school by the third week of July so that we could let our community know, prepare for implementation, and as you have suggested, take any needed steps around budget as will be needed. And that will include, as the trustees have discussed, could include and likely will include adding staff, as you've noted, around particular health functions, that screening, nurses. I mean, there are just a variety of things that will need to occur that may require adding or redeploying of staff. So yes, the end of July is our hoped for time.
Thank you, Dr. Swift. And one last question I just thought of is, do you think that there will be an issue, problematic in hiring these new people? I mean, I know school nurses are always in demand. Does our HR department, have they raised any issues or concerns regarding hiring the right people in this timely manner?
I appreciate that question. We absolutely are always concerned about being able to add the very best staff that we can find. And yet we cannot move ahead of knowing what our finances are going to be and how best to prepare. So therein, you've hit exactly the nail on the head. Therein lies the tension in this summer work that we have ahead of us.
Wow. Well, keep up the good work, and I know you'll keep us posted. So I guess if anyone's asking, it looks like we are indeed meeting in July. There's a lot to discuss and discover. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Nelson, I saw your hand go up for a moment. Did you take that down on purpose, or do you still have a comment?
I took it down on purpose. It was up by accident. Thank you for checking, though.
Very good. I just didn't want to miss anything. Thank you. Trustee Lazarus, is that on purpose?
That is on purpose. Thank you.
Okay.
Speaking of school nurses, has there been any conversation? I know that Oakland County, they are actually, their ISD, they're hiring nurses that would be distributed around their county. Has the WISD had any conversations with that, with the districts at all, where they would help us provide nurses?
Thank you for that question. I'm pleased to hear about, I had not heard about that example. I am with them tomorrow morning early, so you're giving me a great question to pose. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the conversation from trustees and the questions. I did have one about what are unexpected things to keep an eye on, but I feel like that was fleshed out. So I just have one quick question then. Mr. Demetrio, you talked about the school aid fund being projected to be short. Was it projected to be short prior to the pandemic when we were looking at it in, say, February? Did anybody see this shortfall coming, or is this specifically pandemic related?
It is specifically pandemic related. I think one of the first slides that I started the presentation is what the governor proposed, which would have been an additional $6.5 million of funding for Ann Arbor Public Schools. At that time, there was plenty of money to in the coffers, but because of the pandemic and the economy stopping, the projections in May were they're projecting that there will be $1.1 billion short in the school aid fund. There's also even a higher percentage, a higher amount, I believe, in the general fund of the state. So our assumption is that because of that those numbers are true, and that's the equivalent of approximately $700 per student. So that's why we reduced the foundation that amount. Depending on what happens, which we don't know now, there are several conversations at the federal level about how much funding they're going to, the next stimulus package, how big or how small it's going to be, and what it's going to cover and so forth. So depending on that, and depending what happens in August, because definitely part of the state has gone back to work, and I'm not sure what the assumptions were to be the $1.1 billion when people were to return to work and all those assumptions. But they're going to have another revenue estimating conference in August, so we should have much better numbers in August, especially for 1920 and 2021. I would, in August, we'll have I think it's August 15th, we'll have a much better idea if that $1.1 billion that they projected as a shortage, if that is true or not, if that has changed.
I just want to add in there, Trustee Kelly, I appreciate the question. When Mr. Demetrio put up that slide from the governor, it seems like it's been 100 years since we thought we were going to get an additional 6.5 million, or at least that was part of the conversation. And you raise a very interesting point that all the trustees are keenly aware of, and that is how quickly the floor can drop out on a state budget and on a school district budget. So, but I was rather wistful for a moment, Marios, when you had that slide up.
It was a different era for sure. Thank you for that presentation.